One scholar we've featured on this channel who is actually quite critical of Muslim liberals and reformers, but from a very different perspective than Muslim traditionalists would be, is Aaron Hughes. He has repeatedly critiqued Muslim liberals and reformists for creating an Islam that is egalitarian, progressive, and pluralistic, which they label as more authentic or faithful to Islamic scriptural sources. And it is a rhetoric of authenticity that is visible in your book. There are words like this is more faithful to the Quran, this interpretation is truer. Um, he argues that scholars who equate sort of originary and pristine Islam with notions of democracy, liberalism, gender justice, and equality are not engaging in scholarship, but actually mythopoesis. And indeed, the same sort of presentist mythopoesis that their opponents, like Salafis, who engage in when they project their own conceptions of authenticity and rhetoric of authenticity onto the Prophet and his early followers. How would you respond to that critique? Do you believe that it's useful to engage in an apologetic rhetoric of authenticity? Or would it be more useful perhaps to reveal it to be itself an apologetic construct, if that makes sense?
Made super sense. And I would respond to that critique by largely agreeing with that because
Mhm.
uh, I think it is indeed too much apologetics to argue that all the modern values that we have in the modern world today, freedom of speech and religion and democracy and women's rights and let alone gender, plurality and all, it was all there. We just need to read the Quran again and we will just find them all there. Or the most perfect democracy was already there when the first caliphs came with bay'ah instead of hereditary succession. So here we have democracy problem solved. I mean, there's a lot of that sort of modernist approach. I personally try not to go that route. My approach is rather to say, look, there are some modern values. Not everything in the modern world is good, but there are some good parts of it. And freedom and human rights and, a liberal democratic government is one of those. And we're seeing when they start to go down, what happens these days. Some people are saying, "Oh my God, you were speaking, liberalism. What's happening now?" Well, you see what is happening when it's not there, or at least when it's declining. This doesn't mean that we will all find them, but this also doesn't mean that from the Quran we cannot find sources of inspiration for that. We cannot find some seeds of those ideas. Actually, there's this term "seeds of freedom" in Islam, coined by Daniel Philpott, a Catholic scholar, very respectfully studied the religious freedom issues in Islam. He has a book, Religious Freedom in Islam, and he says there are seeds of freedom. Like, for example, take the Constitution of Medina, which we didn't discuss in this book. I mean, there are some modernists today who would say Constitution of Medina gives us the most ideal government ever you can imagine. It's a democracy, it's a liberal, like any. Well, no. I mean, Constitution of Medina was much something more simple than that. But there are no elections, or it's not individual between individuals, between tribes, and all that. But there's still something remarkable in the Constitution of Medina. It's not the Constitution, actually, the Charter of Medina or the Agreement of Medina, the Pact. It says to Muslims their religion, to Jews their religion. It doesn't say Jews have to convert to Islam, right? It explicitly acknowledges that there is an other religious community in Medina, and it explicitly gives them the right to practice their religion. Now, as a modernist, I would highlight this as a source of inspiration for religious pluralism today, which would need to go beyond that framework. Because there were Jews and Christians in Medina. Oh, it didn't say anything about Baha'is or Ahmadis in Pakistan, or I mean, there are many groups beyond the traditional Ahl al-Kitab, or atheists. I mean, atheists were not a group back then, and you don't. Today, you need a much broader framework. But the very fact that the Prophet of Islam, had this treaty with the Jewish tribes in Medina, as it's not Quranic, obviously, but it is a very authentic document, as many, modern historians think. I think that's something there. So therefore, I know Aaron Hughes. I mean, I don't know in person. I actually use more of his works on Islam and Jewish relations and history. He has, I think, good books about that as well. He acknowledges Islamic contributions to Jewish theology, which I quoted in my book, The Islamic Moses. Uh, on this, I haven't read his critiques on this, but when you ask the question, it sounds okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of a apologetic, naive take on modernism. Uh, I hope I'm not doing that, or even if I did it in the past, I'm not saying that today, because I think we should be factual and honest, and I think we should understand that the Quran and the prophetic example, as as crucial as they are for us Muslims, they're not meant to be give us political blueprints that are going to be relevant forever in every age. I mean, the Quran engaged with the problems and cultures of 7th century Arabia while proclaiming eternal truths. And I respect it all, but uh, in those truths, I see evidence of basis, sources of inspiration for some values today we can expand, and religious freedom is one of those.
An additional critique that could be level at the book from an academic approach in terms of what you just read in terms of documents and sources is the absence of a coherent approach to source criticism. So you mentioned, for example, that the Constitution of Medina is accepted as a has there's an academic consensus now that it is authentic, it could be traced back to the Prophet. But in relation to other sources like the Hadith literature, the Sirah literature, there's no established methodology set out in the book to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic sources. And you do cite sort of historical critical scholarship in the footnotes, but HCM itself is not actively used in a sort of systemic and sustained way within the body of the essays. And academic approaches to hadith like Ikma, Isnad, and analysis are completely unmentioned and absent,
Mhm.
despite the fact that we have major recent advances being made in their application by both Muslim and non-Muslim scholars. Some might argue that the sources appear to be sort of accepted or rejected solely on account of their utility to fit with the conclusions of the work, which is sort of advocacy for individual liberty. In the same way that classical jurists can be charged with the same issue. Um, do you regard HCM as a useful tool to engage with when validating your work, or is it because your readership is non-academic, or the readership that you're aiming the book towards is not necessarily academic? You don't think it's a useful tool for lay Muslims to engage with?